Good morning, Vikings fans. This is Morning Joe's, the only morning show solely dedicated to the Minnesota Vikings, and I'm starting to understand why. I am your host, Joe Johnson, owner of PurplePTSD.com, VikingsTerritory.com, and co-host of the Purple Journal podcast with my co-host here, Mr. Joe Oberly, who is back from a vacation. Good morning, man. How you doing?
We're the only show dedicated to the morning Vikings fans. MOURNIN.
That is correct. Well, luckily we were off last Friday, so we did a combo show earlier in the week because you, as you may or may not know, went on vacation, and it sounded really amazing, actually.
Oh, we had some fun. We did some hiking. Played a little golf, drank plenty of beer. Old high school buddies we get together every 5 years just to see if each other's still alive, and we all were and are, and so that's good. It was fun, but we not as wild as we used to be, Joe.
Doesn't take as much either. No. Maybe, I don't know. I think you mentioned that you were flying back during the game, and I mentioned off air that you didn't miss much, but that's not necessarily true. You know, it's funny, we've been, with the freedom that the internet provides, we've been doing a lot of different content, experimental content, and we've done some live commentary that has covered the first half, and this game really felt like, man, up until that around 2 minutes in the first half, the Vikings seemed to be in the driver's seat. You know, the first drive that the Saints had was a little scary, but after that the team hunkered down and things felt great up until that point. But I wanted your...
Go ahead.
No, what were you going to say?
Go ahead and ask what you wanted.
Well, I was more thinking of gut reactions, which is what we typically do on Tuesdays, but it was a little hard because you were a little disjointed watching the game. I will say that, you know, I'm not one for moral victories at all, and I'm not going there this week. This game, there were a lot of injured players, so on and so forth, but it just really made me... There was a lot to not like outside of just the turnovers that maybe aren't sustainable or things that we have to worry about long term because it's, you know, the two of the best players on the team did uncharacteristic things that were not characteristic of them. But, you know, my biggest thing coming out of this game is something I've harped on all season, and that's, I really don't think that this team can win when Cousins is pressured the way he has been. I know there was injuries on the line, and I also know that he's been amazing when it comes to his accuracy while being pressured, but at some point something's got to give, whether it be an injury or, you know, looking long term, I don't see how this team can win a Super Bowl with this offensive line. I just don't. And that's the underpinning of this game. Cousins was pressured a lot, and he did a lot of great things, but, you know, when does that end? I put that out there because the trade deadline is today at 3 p.m. I don't expect them to make any moves. They already made a trade for the offensive line, but it would be nice to maybe see them actually do something on the line, because I don't think a team that's done big trades for Sam Bradford, for example, that have shown how all in they are on this team winning the Super Bowl, they can't look at this line and say, hey, we can go into any stadium and you know, pound the ball or protect our quarterback even. It's just 50%, near 50% pressures on dropbacks. That's terrible.
Yeah. I guess if you're looking for my gut reaction to the game, yeah, it was a little disjointed, my viewing of it, but I look at it this way. I mean, it all depends on your expectations going in, and if you thought the Vikings were a Super Bowl team and you knew this was going to be a big test, but my thoughts going in was that this is going to be a shootout. You know, you gotta stay and you gotta play with Drew Brees. That team is playing at the peak performance right now. They're cruising, and in that game you cannot have 14-point swing. You can't be marching down.
Room for error.
Yeah, 10-point lead at halftime, fumble, have that thing return the other way, tack on 15 because your rookie first-round receiver is a knucklehead, and then that's just handing them the game. I mean,
yeah.
And then you go the margin for error is that slim because and you have the next one in the second half when Cousins throws the ball. I know Diggs is supposedly, said he stopped his route short. Well, both of the quarterback and the receiver are supposed to read that. They're supposed to read, Diggs is going to stop that because he knows where the guy is trailing that way towards the, he knows where the defender's going, so he stops short to sit in that zone for Cousins. Cousins under duress. He's hoping that he's going to be there, not knowing because he didn't have time to read it. He was under pressure, so he throws it. So they both got some skin in that one.
Yeah, that's interesting too. This week, and we'll talk about this, but Diggs took the blame for that. But I hadn't heard a lot of people saying, "Well, yeah, Cousins also had a part to play in that."
That's my take on it this morning, and you can't have those turnovers in a game that is going to be so tight. You can't give. Perhaps the GOAT, if you want to talk about passing yards right now, that kind of thing. He's playing at the top. Brees is playing at the top of his game. They've got such weapons on offense. They are going to score, and you got to be able to answer every time. Well, that's the game in a nutshell. As I wrote in my recap, that it turned on those plays. And it turned on the Thielen play. I mean, that is such a harsh thing. I mean, he deflates you at halftime.
Yeah.
You come out and you're all of a sudden climbing uphill when you should have been playing downhill.
Yeah.
The Vikings were in this game. In fact, they were playing well enough to win it early on. And and not only that, Thielen's fumble should have been demoralizing the other way because they just intercepted Brees for the first time this season.
Yes.
And rather than trying to hold on to their slim 3-point lead, before half, they were in position to go up 10. It's like, damn, that's a bad beat. Harsh to come back from. And so my gut reaction is the Vikings are every bit as good and can play with this team. They should have beat them. They could have beat them. They made mistakes that caused them not to win the game. Can they beat them in the playoffs? Sure. Are they good enough team to make the playoffs? Yes. Can Kirk Cousins lead them there? Yes. Does that mean any of it's going to happen? No. You play the game. You see what happens. If you make mistakes, you lose. And if you capitalize on the other team's mistakes, you win. That's the way this game is played. And so to expect them and that the sky is falling or that they have to all of a sudden make trades, which you're not going to do at the deadline for an offensive line because he's never going to fit in. But anyway, that's not going to happen. So, this is a team. Play with them. Go. And get them next time.
And I do want to mention, and I apologize, Joe writes for the Sports Post in addition to our sites. So check out the Sports Post, Joe. You do a lot of great stuff over there, and you're not a big self-promotion guy, but your articles over there are really, really good. All your articles are good. Yeah.
That's what I asked you for, Joe, to promote me.
Let's get into Tuesday's Tales of the Tape because a lot of these things are tied together, and I want to make sure that we focus on those first. But I do have your answer that you don't think they'll make a move at the trade deadline. I didn't want to make it seem like it was, and I don't think you were implying that, but that it would be super reactionary just to one game, and obviously, you got 40% of the line was out. I just think that Rashad Hill is really, really bad, and I don't know Luke Braun, who co-hosts the Purple Journal podcast with us, has been talking about that a lot, and that the solution is right in front of them. So hopefully, maybe not so much a trade, but hello. I think, let's see. So I think we got disconnected. This is live radio. Ladies and gentlemen, that may be on my end, but let's check and see. I don't know why that would have happened. Let's see here. Let's call Joe, reconnecting to Joe. Well, maybe he just lost faith in the team and gave up. I wonder if you guys can hear this. It's super catchy. Whoop whoop. I can see some people are still here. I apologize. This is the first time this has happened, but I'll just keep going, and if he calls back or rejoins the call, let's see, I'll try one more time, and then I can keep going. Yeah. I want to start freestyling. Wop wop. Alright, well, I'll see if he can rejoin at some point. It seems like everything is fine on our end. And I'll actually go with the take that Joe didn't want to touch anyway. And that's the Adrian Peterson storyline. And hopefully he'll be able to join. He did just text me that his Wi-Fi went out. So as long as it's not my fault, I don't feel too bad about it. So I saw a stat this morning that Adrian Peterson was 137 yards from being the fourth player in NFL history to have 10,000 yards rushing and 100+ touchdowns in his career. And that's something that I'm really torn on how I feel about Adrian Peterson as a player, and not necessarily as a person. I don't think he's the world's best person. But at one point, he was the franchise. He was Purple Jesus, a lot like PurplePTSD.com. It was interesting to see people try to change their... Oh, I do believe that's Mr. Oberly. Right in time. Joe.
Hello. Sorry, man.
You're back.
Electricity went out at the house, and
wow.
So the Wi-Fi went out. It just everything went down. And last I heard was we said Purple Journal podcast at the same time, and boom!
Jinx, like the biggest jinx of all time. It looks like people are still here. I saw some people chatting about the Kirk Cousins pocket presence. I actually went into. I expected you to rejoin, so I went into the Adrian Peterson take, which I will sum up here. Which was I'm conflicted as to how I feel about him as a player. As a person, I know where I stand on him. But he's 137 yards from being the fourth player in NFL history with 10,000 yards rushing and 100 touchdowns or more. And he seems, I think his quote this week was, "I'm getting better every week." He has some sort of shoulder injury. I don't.
Go ahead.
I just don't. There was no way the Vikings were going to be able to keep him financially, unless he took a huge pay cut, which he, in retrospect, probably should have done. But it's AP, and he's got this really high perception of himself, which he should. How do you feel about AP as a player? I mean, do you root for him yourself? Do you kind of want him to, kind of just stay out of sight, out of mind?
I don't know. I guess I'm ambivalent. I loved watching him when he was here, and until things went sour, it was great. It did go sour in a big way, and the ending was not good. So, excuse me. I'm happy that he's doing well. I'd hate the rest of his career to be like we saw him with the Saints, Cardinals. I mean, I liked him enough. He gave me enough joy that I'm happy for him to continue to do well. I think he's just foolish as he was before to say that that he's going to beat Emmitt Smith. I'm about to do it for the Sports Post, a story on record breakers, and I'm going to mention him because there's a lot of players that are on the verge or already breaking records this season.
Yeah,
among them, and he won't do that. I mean, I think when push comes to shove, it's easy to defend Peterson if you focus on him. I have to go back and look and see why Washington is doing so well. I think part of it is that.
Oh no, Joe! Ooh, it happened again. I'll pick up where he left off because this is a well-oiled machine. I am wondering why the Redskins are doing so well. I think what Joe was going to say is that the division is kind of a toss-up. That helps. A lot of this, the reason I mainly bring it up is to tie it back to Kirk Cousins. And there was an article, you wonder how well they'd be doing if Cousins was still there. I can almost see a playoff game with the Redskins in my mind, which would be amazing, storyline-wise. There was an article on Bleacher Report, and I understand that Bleacher Report has and I'm not throwing shade their way at all, but they have lower standards in regards to what gets posted on their website than other sites do. I think they're built more on a community-based model. I know they really used to be. I don't know if they've tightened that up lately. I do feel like they have less just clickbait type stuff or outlandish takes than they used to. But there was an article posted, I forget the author's name, that talked about Cousins being a $84 million flop. And his point was, and that sounds really clickbaity too, but he sounded like a real author, and that's coming from me, Pulitzer Prize winner, for all my work over at Reddit. He basically said, to sum it up for you, that Cousins is flashy, but he doesn't win. He puts up numbers. He used the Saints game as a microcosm, basically saying that, he got a garbage time touchdown, and he outthrew Breeze by triple, but they lost. And that's a criticism that followed Cousins to Minnesota, along with other things that don't make a lot of sense. Like, well, if the Redskins wanted to get rid of him, there must be a problem. And it's like, well, they're the Redskins, though. How much faith do you really put into their ownership? It's like saying the Timberwolves let somebody go or traded a young prospect for a guy who was going to demand a trade, the Jimmy Butler situation. I don't put a lot of stock into that. I don't know how you can quantify or measure garbage time stuff. Maybe that's something that one of our sponsors, Pro Football Focus, can do. But I don't think it's fair at all to blame this start to the season on Cousins. I think anybody that has watched these games, and I understand that national writers can't watch every game. They can watch highlights or they can watch recapped, all 22 like tape. But the statistics, like Cousins being the second most accurate passer while under duress, and he's under duress on almost half of his dropbacks. So when people talk about why is he fumbling so much or why is he getting so many balls batted down, there is some part of that is he can take the blame for. But when you combine the amount of dropbacks or throwing attempts that the Vikings have had this season with an offensive line that gives up a lot of pressures, you're going to get that. It'll vary based on who the quarterback is, but I think the author pointed out, okay, so like Joe was talking about, the Diggs pick six was mostly Diggs' fault, but you'll never see Aaron Rodgers make that mistake, which is complete garbage. I mean, Aaron Rodgers throws interceptions too. At the same time, Cousins is still only half a season in to learning the different nuances of these players. So to say that's the difference between Cousins and elite quarterbacks is stupid. And to blame anything with Case Keenum, this team would have maybe two wins this season. He was really good at getting out of pressure as well, but he wasn't the accurate passer that Cousins is. He wasn't able to see down the field like Cousins. The team didn't even give him the opportunity to. So to blame Cousins, and I'll put it out there that I am an apologist for him. I will be labeled that forever. I was probably the first and most vocal proponent of him coming in the Minnesota media market. And so, yeah, I just don't think at this point you can really blame him. Joe's Tuesday's Tales of the Tape kind of backs that up as well. He breaks down Cousins' day and the amount of pressure that was in his face and what he did to kind of spell that. A big storyline before we delve into the game more, and hopefully Joe will be able to rejoin us at some point, was the fact that Thielen did, despite the loss, did tie Megatron in terms of the amount of games in a row with 100 yards receiving. He's now completely shattering the record for starting the season with 100 yards passing. I think he's 2 games over now. And it looks like Mr. Oberle's power is out again. So, sorry for stuttering here, but I was texting him as well. And I'm also driving. And I'm pretty sure that cat was a person. That's a joke. I'm not that awful yet. But Thielen did tie Megatron. There's been a lot of talk from people in our pregame shows, our commentary, where would he rank after this season, or if he stopped playing for whatever reason or couldn't play anymore, and whether or not he'd make the Ring of Honor. Just a lot of off-season topics, really. Those are some deep off-season, like, we need news type topics. But in that regard, Thielen actually joined a pretty awesome club for Vikings receivers. There have actually only been, let me double check, 4 Vikings receivers with 3 or more 900-yard seasons. And I wonder out there if you can guess who. I'll give you a hint. 50% of them have the same last name. That would be Anthony Carter, Chris Carter, Randy Moss, and Jake Reed. That's how my dad used to always say it. Jake Reed was like the Treadwell of the 90s. He had all this supposed physical power or ability, and he would always drop like a clutch third down. And one of I think that was the first words I spoke which in the 90s would have made me a mute until I was 12, but yeah, Jake Reed. I also put that out there because my dad's probably the only one still listening to this Hindenburg of an episode. Thielen is great, though. We've been talking about him every week as the games go on, the seasons go on, and as he gets closer and closer to that record and then beating it. But it's just for the 90s kids out there that used to go to camp. I used to go to camp every year up until they traded Randy Moss, actually. And I used to remember watching Ryan Hogue, who I think was from he was from a small Minnesota school. He had the body type of a receiver. He was like a camp star. He looked amazing in training camp. And for whatever reason, he never made the active roster, but he had a ton of fans. People would always cheer for him. And I feel like Thielen is Ryan Hogue if he had made the team. He had that same Minnesota pride, all of that. And so it's really fun to watch these guys, and it's such a strange thing to have that Saints game basically boil down to two plays where those two guys in Diggs and Thielen kind of let the team down, and they took responsibility for it, as did Treadwell. Now, Joe mentioned after Thielen fumbled, Treadwell was tackled. He didn't mention this, but he tackled the guy from the Saints who was returning it, and then he threw his helmet at the ground while still on the field, and that was a 15-yard penalty, and there's not much you can do there. And that was such a huge momentum swing. I'd like to think that based on the way the defense was playing, maybe they could have held the Saints to a field goal. They were going to get the ball back before halftime. I also wonder why. I know some of the people in the crowd booed Zimmer and company for basically pulling a Danny Green and taking a knee before halftime. That's a hard one. There's only about 30 seconds left. You just came off a turnover. But it's with this passing offense, with the injuries that the Saints had to their secondary, you'd think that it would have been a completely different thing momentum-wise had they maybe picked up some yards, kicked a field goal, gotten into the half down by 1 point, gotten the ball back. That, shoulda, woulda, coulda, but in games where momentum is so completely key, that's a big part of it, and it would have been nice to see them do that. Spielman came out and said, or Zimmer, came out and said, we win as a team, we lose as a team. He wasn't buying into the narrative that it was anybody's fault or anybody taking the rap for the game. And I wrote about this a little bit on PurplePTSD.com. But outside of Treadwell, which, non-sportsmanlike, I'm not super mad about that. But it's hard to rip on guys who have been, especially in Thielen, who have week after week put everything on the line, spitting up blood a week ago, breaking these records, making that catch that he made where he was completely being interfered with, but he basically reached around the guy anyway while in mid-flight and basically grabbed it. Each week, Thielen, it feels like, has had these otherworldly catches that I don't even remember Randy Moss doing things like this. And so for him, that's a great move, I think, from him. I think it's completely genuine. But, for him to say that this is on me is such a classy move. Same thing with Diggs. And what I liked about what Diggs said was, and I said this in the article, there's a part in Infinity War where in the beginning, after the Hulk crash lands into the Sanctum Sanctorum for Doctor Strange, he says, or no, actually it's on the ship when Doctor Strange, Iron Man, and Spider-Man are flying towards Thanos' planet, and he goes, no, you don't understand. Thanos has been living in my brain for the last 6 years. And Diggs mentioned that, he's really not going to be able to get this out of his brain until the Vikings meet the Saints again. It feels a lot like something Williams would have said after the DB or safety. Oh, DB works after the Minneapolis Miracle. I feel like Diggs wants to redeem himself, and he's going to obsess over it. And the idea of that should terrify the Saints, especially if they meet the Vikings in the playoffs, and especially if they're still dinged up in the secondary position, which it seems like it. They had some season-ending injuries, and they did trade for Eli Apple. Back to the trade thing really quickly, though. I would love to see the team make a move. I don't know what that would mean, who's available, but just the idea that there's some teams like the Saints that are saying we want to win a Super Bowl, and this is how we think we can do it. The Saints had some injuries in their secondary, so they traded for a guy that has had a rough start to his career, but he knows a lot of the guys on the Saints because they are all Ohio State guys. So, the Vikings have Elflein, who's from Ohio State. They can make a move just to bring in somebody to change things up a little bit, or just to get Rashad Hill. I'm sure he's a nice guy, but he is not an NFL quality player. My dad mentioned when we were talking about the game that Rashad Hill probably wouldn't even start on most college teams. And he's just getting outclassed. I know that the Saints offensive coordinator mentioned that they thought Vikings had a liability at the tackle position. You look at Brian O'Neill, who's performed a lot better than I expected him to. Going off of the guys that I know, that I trust, that were looking at him in training camp, seemed like he was a 2 to 3 year project. And I also heard things like if he wasn't a second round pick, he'd be cut. So to look at that versus what he's done is almost miraculous. Or maybe I'm just getting bad information. It could be one or the other. But he's still not big enough weight-wise. He's getting pushed back a lot. That's the part of the problem. I think he will be a good player and that he's earned that spot. But at this point, they got to do something about Rashad Hill. And I don't know if that's a trade or if that's looking at putting Remmers back at right tackle and then moving O'Neill to left tackle, which is the position that he played in college for the limited amount of time that he did that. That is something maybe they'll figure out during the bye week, but something's got to change until at least Reef comes back. But I will give some props to Treadwell because I've ripped on him so much. He did probably have the best game of his career. He had one first down that would have been crucial that was swatted out of his hands. That's, we were doing a live chat of the game, and I said, God, Treadwell. And one of the guys said, well, you can't blame Treadwell for that. That was great defense. And here's my gripe, and I'll leave it at this. Treadwell was brought in as basically a one-trick pony. If you look back to the way the Vikings were in 2015, most of their passing plays, and I went to 6 of the 8 home games at TCF Stadium that year, were variations of the same play, or at least the same outcome, which was a lot of comeback routes, a lot of button hooks, like players basically running 5 yards past the first down marker and turning and doing a button hook. Nothing, in stride, nothing down the field really. There was some, we got Mike Wallace, so we might as well bomb it type stuff. But that's the team they were because they had Adrian Peterson, because Teddy had problems with timing and getting air under the ball. That's just not me saying that. That's Mr. Tommy Kramer, a Vikings legend, who came on our podcast a few years ago and said that, Teddy's never going to make it because he doesn't have the right mechanics. And he was working on that, and it seemed like things were improving for him before his injury. I actually wrote, I'll admit it, finally, Teddy is the franchise, because I witnessed him working on his mechanics and getting some air under the ball, and he looked great before his injury. But that's why they brought Treadwell in. They brought him in because he was supposed to be this guy who didn't have top end speed but was actually really quick. People forget that he might be the slowest guy in a 40-yard dash, but he's the quickest to get to 10 yards. On top of that, he's supposed to be able to jump up and basically win contested balls. The reason I didn't like Treadwell as a pick really boils down to these two things about that. When you think about a guy who is good at that, you would think that he would have great ups in terms of a vertical jump, and that he would be relatively strong. And according to mockdraftable.com, I think Treadwell was in the bottom 20 percentile, maybe even the bottom 10 percentile for both. And then, both under 20 and then one under 10. And I think it was his bench press reps were really bad, like me doing them level. And, well, you could say, he has natural athletic ability. That would imply still that, I'm jumping ahead of my own thoughts here. So, for him to have those scores, that implies that he really doesn't work out. It's all in context, so they're all being compared. These percentiles are being compared to that class. So sure, there could be a lot of other guys that are super fast, super strong, but this is the entire combine. And you would think, to me, it just read like a guy like that never really had to work out because he was always good. Something that a lot of SEC players seem to have as a syndrome, because they don't really have to go to class or get grades, and they've always been good at a sport that is worshipped in the South. And so that was my fear, that he had a one trick, which was running 10 yards, jumping up, catching the ball, and for the longest time now, it seems like he wasn't even good at that, or that when you get up to the next level and the corners are even faster and they're stronger than you, that's not going to work. So this is the longest examination of a gripe ever. But my gripe was, isn't that what, when the guys, one of the guys in our chat said, well, that was, can't blame Treadwell for that. But that's what we brought him in for. So if you can't do that, then it's over, Mr. Munson. But no, he did have a few catches, and it was the best game of his career. But the bar is so low with him that anything is just gravy at this point. Mainly because Thielen turned into the best receiver of all time. And so the Treadwell pick doesn't seem as bad if you're not really paying attention. In terms of the next man up, though, and the injuries that the Vikings had, my big fear, and I feel weird about this, with some context, Morning Joe's is a new show, clearly. But we've been doing some variation of a podcast for a while, me and Joe in particular. We did a podcast out at the Mermaid Bar for a while, then we switched over to the Purple Journal podcast, I think 2 years ago, with Luke Braun. And last year we started a contest that was basically, between Joe and I, we would predict each game, winner and score, and then Luke, as the stats guy, compiles that, keeps track of it, and throughout the season we know who. So if I said the Vikings would win 20-10, and Joe said 50-10, but the score was 9-6, I would be closer, and then how close and what's the difference, and keep track of it that way. So I was the only one on Purple Journal podcast and on the pregame show, which was with Jordan, Hawthorne, and Jack Day, to predict the correct outcome, which was that the Vikings would lose. I feel like garbage about that, but my reasoning for that was that there was just too many injuries, and namely on the defense. And strangely enough, I don't know if it was because of how the game ended up shaking out, short field turnovers, but Breeze had 120 yards passing. He had his first interception of the year. And so I don't want to say that all of a sudden Holton Hill's the second coming or anything, but according to Pro Football Focus, he graded out at, I believe, an 80.1 or 2. He didn't, though, cover Michael Thomas, if I'm reading this correctly. That fell on Trey Waynes, who also had a great game. Speaking of people like having an ongoing narrative in regards to an individual player, the way I do with Treadwell and Cousins, I've also been a long time fan and follower of Trey Waynes, and I feel like he still gets zero credit. There was a lot of people talking about Patrick Peterson, trade Trey Waynes. That was a big narrative this week. You hear that a lot, and I felt like Sunday night was an opportunity for him to have his coming out party on the national level. That didn't end up happening, again, just because of the way the game ended up, but he played relatively well against Michael Thomas, who's an elite receiver. I don't know if the team was shadowing him, but the fact that Holton Hill didn't have to go up against him, at least again according to what I have in front of me, shows that maybe that was their plan, and then maybe switching Curse into, I think, if you're looking for a silver lining in regards to not really the Rhodes injury, but the Mike Hughes injury, it's that it's allowed the Vikings to maybe get more creative defensively than they otherwise would have. Having these looks with 3 safeties, for example, putting Iloka out there as a safety / linebacker, just based on his size, having Curse be a safety / nickel guy at 6'4". I mean, that's just awesome and amazing. So, if you looked on paper, if you told me before the game that Brees would have his first interception of the season and that he would be held to 120 yards, I would have been ecstatic, and I would have said, how do I put Purple PTSD up as collateral for a bet in Vegas? Because I'm going all in on the Vikings winning this game. It didn't happen that way, and that bothers me. I'm not, like I said earlier, I'm not a big moral victory type guy, but I am a guy that holds a grudge and that gets really sad about the team and really lets the team kind of dictate my emotional mood. And this game is going to stick in my craw, for a really long time. They should have won this game. And a lot of people wanted to compare it to the Minneapolis Miracle 2.0, but it really did feel a lot more like 2009 than it did last year. Cousins had triple the yards of Brees. The Vikings had 450 yards offense in 2009 versus like 175. I don't need to explain it to you guys. I mean, if you're listening to this show, you clearly watched the game, but it sucked. I did think, though, that there were some encouraging signs to get into my fortunately, unfortunately. I typically do the opposite. So if they win, I'll say unfortunately, but unfortunately, and when they lose, I say unfortunately, but fortunately. And the fortunate was that, and they got away from this in the second half because they had to, but I don't think anybody would have called the Vikings coming out running the ball as much as they did. Perhaps outside of me. Yuck. Tried to be like meekish or ugh. I apologize to everybody listening. That'll never happen again. But excuse me. They really, the game plan was to run the ball, to kind of dictate the pace of the game, to impose their will, and they were doing that. I think that Murray ended up with almost 4.5 yards a carry, 4.3 yards per carry. I don't think I know. He ran the ball 13 times for 56 yards. They got away from that in the second half because they were down and they had to. But it felt like a huge positive because the Saints unit defensively is the best in the league, quote unquote, at stopping the run. And I asked this question before the game, and I feel like I know the answer now. But if you look at the first half, and then say, well, wow, the Saints held Murray to 56 yards a week, 2 weeks after he had 150, and then he had 90. I think that the flow of the game has been a huge factor in regards to that ranking. I think that with that offense, teams are just not capable of running the ball every drive, so they end up airing the ball out, and that's what happened. I think that if not for those turnovers and that huge sway of momentum, that Murray would have ended up with 150 yards easily. But it didn't end up going that way, and that really sucks. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Dalvin Cook. He basically said something recently that kind of caught me like a what? He basically said he's 100% and he feels great, but the headline I think for the Star Tribune was, but he is wary of any setbacks, and with soft tissue injuries, with hamstrings, that can happen. It's like an acid trip. 70 years later, you'll be driving to church and all of a sudden shit gets all weird on you. Hamstrings are the same way. They can feel fine and then flare up and then you're out. And that's why you see a lot of teams being a lot more conservative in that regard than they've really ever been. And so it was just strange to see the article start with Cook saying, well, yeah, I feel 100%. I feel great, but I'm not sure I'll practice this week. It's like, what? Because I think the plan, and it hasn't been announced or anything, but I think the plan is that they want to hold him out until after the bye, pull a Fournette. And that's, the week after next, so that's, and maybe they're being a tad bit too conservative. But if that means they get him back for the end of the season, for any potential playoff run, I'm all for it. There's nobody saying, well, if we had Dalvin Cook, things would have been different, It would be amazing to have him. And really, if you think about it, we had him for only a handful of games. This isn't like I'm breaking anyone's or blowing anyone's mind, a la that 70-year-old tripping on acid at church. But, we don't really know what kind of back he is yet. And so that'll be fun to see, I guess, if things go sideways. But if they have to be conservative against the Lions, one more game, then the bye, let them do it. It's better than having him be out for the rest of the year. We were going to do first half grades and for position groups and then just for Cousins in general, just because of what a huge deal it was getting him, how much he cost, what the expectations were, how he's been. I will give him an A- in regards to his first half. I think that he's done everything the team has asked of him or could have asked of him. I think he's really gone above and beyond. He had the chance to go to another team for more money. And granted, he was already making, which was at the time a record-breaking amount of money, but he could have gone to the Jets and gotten, an even $30 million a year, and been set. But he came here, and that was before the draft, so I wonder if he had a different expectation about the offensive line. But the guy is playing at a really high level despite that. And it drives me crazy, and it will continue to do so. There was an article this week that talked about the Wisconsin Badgers having 5 offensive linemen currently that will all be high draft picks in the NFL. And they were comparing it to a team from a couple years ago that had 4. And then I think the 5th was just and then there was another guy that was behind someone that ended up being like a first or second round pick. And I know I push this Big Ten thing all the time, but no one else is here, so I can do whatever I want. But Spielman's kid goes to Nebraska, so he's tuned into the Big Ten. You would hope that they understand that, if you're going to call Penn State linebacker U, Penn State being another Big Ten team, then people, this is way too late. It should have been called this a long time ago. But Wisconsin is offensive line U. And they really have to look at getting those types of guys on the roster next year. Some of these divisions in college play spread football, spread offenses. So they want smaller and lighter guys on their offensive line that can get out in space and that are more quote-unquote athletic and aren't as big, chunky, slow, whatever. The NFL does have some aspects of that. I think before Sperano, the Vikings went that route and wanted these athletic guys. I mean, you look at what happened to Matt Khalil when he decided to drop all that weight, get healthy, and part of that, he did lose weight with pneumonia, but I think he either didn't regain as much or he gained it and then lost it and was on this health kick, and it killed him. I mean, look at what I just said about Ryan O'Neal not being big enough yet. Let's just shore up this position. I don't care if they use every draft pick that they have. You can't, maybe not with the trade deadline today, but we have Cousins for 3 years. We have all these defensive guys for years. Let's just make up for the fact that they've neglected the offensive line position basically every year since Matt Khalil last year, notwithstanding, because they did get Elfline, and O'Neal's okay, I guess, but should have gone with the guard in the first round from Iowa. But that's really, I think, what's going to come down to it. So this is a long way of me saying that Cousins, another Big Ten guy, has been amazing under the circumstances. And he's throwing the ball to great guys. I understand that too. And it's hard not to give A's to Thielen and everything. But in terms of the offensive as a whole, I would say really like a B. Too many mistakes. Somebody in our live chat said, when Cousins can get going, he really gets going. And it's like, well, it's too disjointed. There's too many false starts or holdings or things like that. There's too many turnovers. That's on Cousins too, hence the minus. But Cousins is on track for 5,042 yards, 32 touchdowns, and 8 interceptions. That's amazing. Thielen is on track for 1,850 yards and 12 touchdowns. Diggs, I think, is going to have a huge second half to his season. People wonder why teams aren't scheming against Thielen or shutting him down. And that's because it's almost impossible to. They can't just shadow him. He lines up, and Diggs does too, lines up in so many different places. Lines up in the slot a lot, runs every route possible. So you would have to basically not just have one or two guys. It takes the whole team effort. And when they do that, then they leave somebody else wide open, that person being Diggs. And so far it seems like teams have been more afraid of Diggs deep than Thielen picking up 15, 20 yards at a time, even though Thielen's been able to go deep a lot too. So I think that they're going to switch to Diggs a little bit more in terms of shutting down Thielen, and that, they'll end up with relatively the same amount of yards at the end of the season. That's my midseason prediction. Defense, that's a tough one. I did feel like, and I still feel like, even after the Saints game, that the defense was, finding its place. When you have a team with 10 starters returning, that was the number one defense in the league in almost every category. And then the 11th guy is a massive improvement to the position, that person being Sheldon Richardson. That these guys, I don't want to say have the luxury, but kind of started out in a funk, but know each other well enough and have enough faith in themselves to really not take, I don't want to say take their time, but they have the confidence that they're going to figure it out. I do think a large component of all of that stems from perhaps Zimmer overthinking things and being really freaked out by what Doug Peterson did to the team, so he tried to come up with like this perfect system, like the guy from A Beautiful Mind. Zimmer's in some shed in his backyard. He's got red yarn connecting everything. Nick Foles throws to this guy, then this guy can do that, and it's just, it was too much even for these guys. And you almost, you got that sense. My mental image of the Eagles game was a play where Harrison Smith basically got burned, but he looked like way out of position, and he's almost like putting his arms up like, what am I doing? I think they overschemed for that game. I think they overschemed a lot to begin this season, and now they're basically saying, we got a lot of good guys on this team. Even if we play semi-base defense for a Zimmer defense, we'll beat you just based on talent. If you look at, Luke Braun wrote an article about the difference between the Vikings and Saints secondary last week, and he showed some tape. So I don't want to say that they're back to some sort of training camp defense. It's still a Zimmer defense. They're still, throwing tricks and pre-snap adjustments and all that. But it's not as esoteric as it was earlier in the season. So I'll give them also a B minus. I do think there's room for improvement. I wonder or worry about the schedule coming up, and that's the final thing that I'll touch on. And I want to thank everyone who's still listening. We get a decent amount of feedback, and some of the feedback is, I really appreciate all the feedback, and I don't want it to sound like I'm being defensive at all, but I don't think people understand the show that they're listening to, that we can't edit things because it is a live show, and maybe it is a little more informal, but that's what we're going for. Not like a lazy informal, but like you and your friends are talking about the game type of informal. So, thanks everyone who made it through earlier. It's a live show. It's just us. We don't have like a producer or anything because I killed him. And so we're going to have stuff like that, but we're getting better. The rest of the schedule, so we have the Lions, then the bye, then the Bears, Packers, New England, Seattle, Miami, Detroit again, and then the Bears. The Bears have been a thorn. Really, both the Bears and the Lions have been thorns in Zimmer's side since he's gotten here. And obviously we haven't played them yet this season. The Bears defense without Khalil Mack was a young, good unit. With Khalil Mack, they scare me, especially with this offensive line. I really think that we should eye those two games as a split. Detroit, for whatever reason, has been tough. I think that because of that, Zimmer's made it like an additional point that he needs to beat them. So I hope they can win both those games. But that's scary. I know Zimmer in terms of halfway through the season grades said that basically this week that they're 3-1. They were 3-1 in October, and that he can call things as he sees them. That when he's pissed off about something, he'll make it clear. But he basically said he thinks that the team's on the right path and that they're a pretty good football team right now. Were his words. So I don't think that they'll make any trades, but I do think that he fully expects to beat the Lions. The Bears, Khalil Mack is going to feast. I hope to God that Reef is back by then. He should be. That's after the bye. So then you have the Packers. That's a huge game. Might come down to the division. The Packers were shutting out the Rams for a while. I didn't have a chance to watch that game, but it sounds like the Packers had a huge opportunity to win, and Ty Montgomery fumbled the kick return, and I think I saw something that he did something he wasn't supposed to do. Maybe he tried to return it when he wasn't supposed to, whatever. The Patriots, I think it's in Boston. Yikes. The Seahawks are getting better, even though a lot of people thought they were in rebuild mode. The Dolphins have been okay. Even they beat the Bears in overtime with Tannehill. Not without Tannehill, with Brock Osweiler. Then you have the Lions and the Bears again. So the second half of the season, there's really no like Jets games or Bills games, and I mean that in terms of there's no easy like over. Well, that'll be an easy get right game. We don't have any of those, depending on what happens with Miami. So by no means is this at the midway point me saying, well, they just got to shore up this and shore up that before the playoffs start. I've mentioned having Dalvin Cook back would be nice as the season gets over in the playoffs, but I put the caveat out there, assuming they make the playoffs. I by no means think that, and maybe that's a good thing. Maybe the Vikings need to go into the playoffs more like a wild card, or like I'm trying to think of the year 2008, maybe 2008 Giants, where they fought. They didn't have a bye. I'm trying to think. We had a bye last week. They had a bye last season. They had one in 2009. 2001, I think they had one. And then 98, they had one. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we had a bye for every NFC championship that I've been alive for, excluding the 80s one, because I don't remember that. I was like 2. So maybe they need to fight their way through and keep that momentum. And maybe that'll be the key. I don't know. But at this point, I gave some good grades to the team, so I don't want to sound like I'm saying one thing and then feeling another, even though there is a disconnect between the emotional and the logical when it comes to this team, for sure. But yeah, I worry about this offensive line. The only thing that would make me feel okay about it would be Reif's return and then Remmers at right tackle, or forgetting Reif, putting O'Neal there. Rashad Hill, I don't understand why he's still even on the team, to be honest. And it's going to come down to that. You have a quarterback who has trouble with fumbles, with batted balls, and you refuse to make a change that could by itself fix that, just by moving O'Neal to left tackle and Remmers back to right tackle. And so at some point, Luke wrote that in a great article a couple weeks ago. I'll probably write the same thing just so we can keep some attention on the fact that the Vikings have a solution, that they're either too stubborn or just too stubborn. Really, it has to be that they're too stubborn to do it, or they think they have it figured out or something. I don't know. But that's what concerns me. And, maybe they're holding out to the bye week. I don't know. Maybe they think, I don't know. Maybe they're worried about who would play right guard. I don't know. You guys can let me know. We love feedback, whether it's on YouTube or in the comment section of our site. We love that kind of stuff. We also love doing this. So you guys allowing us to do it with all your support, it is great. I don't want to ask anything of anyone, but if you could subscribe to our channels or share them on social media, or if you live in South Carolina, give me $1.5 billion. I'd really appreciate it. I got a text from Joe. His power is out again, like I said, but still out. So hopefully he'll be back next week. Next week on Friday. I know he will. On Friday we'll talk about the Lions game a little bit more in depth, and just news from this week. But I wanted to thank everybody again for listening, and we'll have Joe back on Friday. I'm looking forward to it. Check out our show on Wednesday nights about 8:30. It's the Purple Journal podcast. We do that live, and then it's automatically posted as a podcast after that, 8:30 Central. We have about, I think, this is a good problem to have. It depends on the reason. I know the number, but it depends on how you count them. So on our network now we have 7 shows. One of those is a recent addition, which is the Bleeding Purple podcast, which is Adam Carlson and Tyler Haig. It's a huge show. It means a lot that he moved it onto Purple Territory Radio. And so if you didn't know, or you probably do if you subscribed on iTunes and were like, why do I have all these different shows? We have an amazing amount of shows, an amazing amount of articles, just a great team of guys. And I want to just remind you to check out purpleptsd.com, Vikings Territory. Follow us on social media, because we're really churning out a lot of great stuff and doing what we love. And so hopefully the team will turn this around and we can have more fun and less mourning, as Joe mentioned, with the MOURNING. Yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening. Talk to you guys again in a couple days. Skol.